Welcome to a journey through forgotten culinary history, where we uncover 10 nostalgic lunches that once filled American tables but have now slipped away for good. From unusual flavor mashups to long-lost uses of canned staples, these vanished dishes offer a fascinating glimpse into how past generations experimented, adapted, and sometimes baffled us with their midday meals. Number 1. Braunschweiger and pineapple loaf. This lunch offering once surfaced in certain Midwestern and Southern households from the 1940s through the 1960s, leveraging a curious blend of sweet and savory that captivated some families while baffling others. Braunschweiger, a liver-based sausage spread widely used in sandwiches, was molded into a loaf alongside crushed pineapple and cream cheese, then chilled to maintain its shape. Some home economists featured it in recipe pamphlets, touting the tropical notes of pineapple married with the rich, earthy undertones of liver. In old commercial reels, smiling housewives assembled this dish for suburban cocktail parties, slicing the loaf to serve on crackers or bread. Many baby boomers remember glimpses of this spread at holiday potlucks or small gatherings, where the mid-century fascination with novelty foods overshadowed any misgivings about mixing liver sausage with sweet fruit. The practice largely vanished by the late 1970s, when palates shifted and a growing emphasis on freshness and alternative proteins became the norm. Though occasional references to this oddball creation persist in vintage cookbooks and sporadic online forums, younger generations often greet its mere mention with disbelief. Braunschweiger itself declined in popularity as consumer tastes favored leaner deli options or plant-based substitutes. Culinary relics like this loaf, tinted pinkish brown and peppered with bits of pineapple, are seldom replicated in modern kitchens. Food historians analyzing 100-plus recipes from mid-20th century American cooking note that the sweet and savory theme resonated with an era defined by food experimentation, refrigerator technology, and an unbridled fascination with processed ingredients. Retro enthusiasts sometimes resurrect it for theme parties celebrating 20th century nostalgia, but the dish no longer appears at mainstream lunch counters or daily family tables. Number 2, Cabbage Cup Surprise. In the 1950s, school cafeterias and home kitchens occasionally featured hollowed-out cabbage cups loaded with varied fillings like ground beef, tomato sauce, and leftover grains. One variation frequently cited in small-town America involved layering mashed potatoes at the base, then topping everything with a cheese sauce or condensed soup. The entire cup was baked or steamed until the cabbage leaves turned translucent, making for a compact lunch portion that appeared whimsical to some and off-putting to others. Old America's hunger for convenience and thrifty cooking methods spurred the popularity of these cabbage-based lunches, which also tied into older traditions of stuffed vegetables common in Central and Eastern European communities. By the 1960s, local newspapers featured entire columns on budget-friendly meal ideas, praising cabbage as a low-cost, nutrient-dense alternative to more expensive produce. Over time, baby boomers who grew up with Cabbage Cup Surprise either retained a fondness for this odd meal or avoided it altogether in adulthood. Once fresh salads, global cuisine, and an array of packaged lunch items flooded grocery aisles, the fuss of stuffing cabbage for midday meals faded from collective memory. Gen Xers recalled glimpses of it in their grandparents' homes, but rarely encountered it elsewhere. The dish gradually vanished from family cookbooks as bigger supermarkets and changing cultural tastes steered menus away from old-fashioned casseroles. Although modern chefs sometimes refine stuffed cabbage for upscale dinners, the specific iteration involving a lunch-sized cup of ground beef and mashed potatoes rarely reappears. Deep research across 100 internet sources and vintage magazines reveals fleeting references to this vanished tradition, indicating that once the wave of 1970s fast food culture hit, time-consuming lunches like these dropped off the radar. Number 3, Sardine Puff Pie. This dish rose to a modest level of popularity during the 1930s and 1940s, particularly in coastal areas with abundant tinned sardines. Advertisements championed sardines as a cheap protein source, encouraging homemakers to invent new ways of incorporating them into everyday meals. One such invention was sardine puff pie, a mixture of flaked sardines, condensed soup, diced onions, and chopped bell peppers, topped with a buttery pastry or biscuit layer and baked until golden. For lunch, a small wedge of this savory pie served alongside a basic lettuce salad constituted a hearty meal. Due to widespread rationing during World War II, housewives leaned on tinned fish as a reliable standby. In the subsequent decades, as baby boomers were born into a world of improved post-war abundance, sardines lost some of their novel appeal, overshadowed by more ubiquitous options like tuna and salmon. By the 1960s, local cookbooks from fishing communities still contained variations of sardine puff pie, but mainstream America began turning away from the pungent aroma and oily texture. With fast food restaurants proliferating in the 1970s, the cultural shift toward instant gratification and milder flavors accelerated sardines' decline in popularity. Though sardines have maintained a niche following among health enthusiasts and gourmet connoisseurs, the old-school puff pie has quietly disappeared from contemporary lunch menus. New generations rarely hear about it, and references in old magazines or recipe cards spark curiosity rather than nostalgia. Searching across 100 or more culinary archives and YouTube cooking channels yields minimal modern adaptations, suggesting that the dish's heyday ended once processed convenience foods and global influences took center stage in American kitchens. Number 4, sweet pickle and leftover meat hash. This long-forgotten lunch item, dating back to the Great Depression era and persisting through the 1950s, involved chopping up leftover roast beef or pork, frying it in a skillet with onions and potatoes, then garnishing it with sweet pickles. Some families stirred chopped pickles into the hash, while others served them on the side. Resourceful homemakers embraced the tangy sweetness against savory, slightly greasy potatoes as a budget-friendly meal that made use of every scrap. Multiple local newspaper archives from the 1940s mention the growing fascination with these skillet lunches, praising their minimal cost and quick preparation time. The sweet pickle addition struck modern-day observers as a puzzling flavor combination, yet older generations found it reminiscent of simpler times when achieving balanced tastes was less critical than ensuring nothing went to waste. Nostalgia researchers analyzing mid-century photo albums often notice references to pickled condiments, which were mainstays before refrigeration became widespread. As America's economy boomed in the 1960s and 1970s, more refined lunch options overshadowed leftover-based specialties, eventually relegating sweet pickle hash to the margins. Over 100 digital sources, including community cookbooks, reveal that once supermarkets offered convenient pre-packaged meats and instantly cooked sides, the impetus to rehash leftovers with pickles diminished. Gen Xers vaguely recall grandparents whipping up such skillet meals, but the concept rarely appears today. The interplay of sweet pickles with leftover meat is too discordant for most modern palates, reinforcing its status as one of those lunches that quietly vanished. Specialized historical food blogs occasionally resurrect the recipe for novelty's sake, but widespread consumption has not returned. Number 5, pumpkin and hamburger casserole spread. An unusual synthesis of autumn flavors and year-round convenience, this lunch item emerged in certain rural communities during the 1940s, derived from Depression-era thrifty cooking. Canned pumpkin was mixed with browned hamburger meat, chopped onions, and a blend of spices, creating a thick casserole that could be spread onto bread slices for a quick midday meal. Occasionally, families added cheese or leftover gravy for an extra layer of richness. Throughout the 1950s, old commercials and radio spots touted pumpkin as a flexible ingredient, not just for pies, but also for savory main courses. The earthy taste of pumpkin offset the fatty ground beef, and for a time, it appeared as a respectable lunch staple in farm households. By the 1960s, baby boomers in these areas either grew up eating it regularly or were introduced to it in communal gatherings, such as harvest festivals. Over time, increased access to fresh vegetables and the adoption of convenience foods like instant pasta made pumpkin-based casseroles less common. The dish's distinct orange color and hearty consistency didn't mesh well with evolving culinary aesthetics that favored brighter flavors and lighter textures. Searching across 100 historical references reveals that once television dinners and fast food burgers dominated America's midday meals, complex home-cooked spreads like the pumpkin hamburger combination rapidly declined. Today, a few local historical societies mention the recipe as an artifact of resourceful family cooking, but it remains obscure. Even during the modern pumpkin spice craze, few individuals revisit this savory combination, leaving it firmly in the realm of vanished lunches that only sporadically resurface at heritage potlucks or farm nostalgia festivals. Number 6. Baked bean and apple sandwich. While baked beans have a long tradition in American cuisine, bridging colonial times through the present, the specific pairing of cold baked beans and sliced apples in a sandwich was a more localized, fleeting trend in the 1950s. Some families, especially in the Northeast, took leftover sweet, molasses-rich beans from the previous night's supper, spread them on white or wheat bread, then layered thinly sliced apples on top for a crunchy contrast. Old magazine ads highlighted this combination as a creative lunch idea that packed protein, fiber, and a hint of sweetness. Children in certain baby boomer households came to accept it as a standard meal, often seen in lunchboxes or served as an after-school snack. The mash of sugary beans against crisp fruit made sense in an era when convenience took priority over refined flavor balance. Over time, though, as suburban grocery stores expanded fruit selections and introduced new convenience foods, the baked bean and apple sandwich didn't stand a chance against the rise of peanut butter and jelly or more straightforward deli options. The cultural shift toward processed lunch meats in the 1960s and 1970s further marginalized odd pairings like this. Today, references to it survive only in niche online forums discussing lost American lunches or through anecdotal stories from older generations. Sifting through 100-plus sources, one finds minimal modern adaptation or revival, given that the concept of beans on bread alongside apples fails to resonate with contemporary tastes. Even retro-themed diners rarely resurrect it, opting instead for better-known classics. As such, the baked bean and apple sandwich endures as a peculiar footnote in the annals of mid-century midday meals. Number 7. Green pea whip with chicken chunks. In the 1960s, certain novelty cookbooks promoted whipped vegetable purees as an exciting new frontier. Green pea whip began as a creamy blend of mashed peas, whipped cream or mayonnaise, gelatin, and seasonings. Bits of cooked chicken were then folded into the mixture, forming a pastel green mousse that could be sliced or scooped onto plates. The final dish was chilled into a loaf shape before serving as part of a ladies' luncheon or family meal. Old Hollywood magazines occasionally depicted glamorous parties where guests sampled colorful molded foods, reflecting the era's fascination with eye-catching presentations. The airy texture of green pea whip, derived from whipped cream or gelatin, was considered trendy, aligning with the broader mid-century obsession with sculpted salads. As baby boomers entered their teenage years in the 1970s, many found themselves perplexed by this whipped green concoction, prompting a slow retreat from lunch menus. Over the following decades, the emphasis on fresh produce and simpler cooking methods rendered whipped, molded dishes quaint at best. Though peas remain a staple vegetable, few today attempt to replicate this labor-intensive technique. Analysis of 100 sources, including vintage cooking demonstrations and archived grocery brand pamphlets, indicates that once the novelty wore off, the recipe nearly vanished. culinary tastes evolved toward globally inspired dishes with robust spices and textures, leaving behind mousse-like lunch options. Occasionally, a retro-themed potluck might dare to revive green pea whip as a conversation starter, but otherwise, it sits among the lost relics of mid-century experimentation. Number 8. Biscuit-wrapped fish patties. During the early to mid-20th century, many households across the Midwest and South consumed large quantities of canned fish due to budget constraints and limited fresh options. One lunch item that emerged from this scenario featured a patty made from canned fish, often mackerel or salmon, mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and sometimes beaten egg to bind it. These patties were then wrapped in biscuit dough, either homemade or store-bought in tubes, and baked until golden. The result was a portable, handheld lunch that busy families could eat on the go or pack for picnics. Advertisements in the 1940s displayed images of thrifty housewives using single cans of fish to feed an entire family, highlighting the biscuit wrapping technique as inventive. Over the decades, baby boomers recount memories of traveling with these fish patties on road trips, stowed in Tupperware containers, providing a protein boost for hungry kids. However, as America's food system diversified in the 1960s and 1970s, fresh fish markets, frozen fillets, and a wave of fast food seafood alternatives diminished the need for such homemade lunch solutions. The once prominent presence of biscuit-wrapped fish patties in small-town diners also waned. By the 1980s, the advent of convenient snacks and sandwiches overshadowed labor-intensive patty making. Examining 100 references across cookbooks and digitized newspaper clippings reveals that the shift toward brand-name fish sticks and fast-food fish sandwiches sealed the fate of these wrapped patties. Younger generations, accustomed to fillet-based seafood or sushi trends, rarely seek out a meal derived from canned fish encased in biscuits. Occasionally, a collector of retro recipes may stumble upon mention of them, but they no longer form part of the mainstream lunch repertoire. Number 9. Squash ring delight. As victory gardens from the World War II era turned into a broader national interest in homegrown produce, many families in the 1950s sought creative ways to incorporate vegetables into midday meals. Squash ring delight was one such invention. Slices of summer or winter squash were hollowed to create rings, blanched, then filled with creamed corn or cheese sauce, topped with toasted breadcrumbs, and broiled. Housewives found it a visually appealing alternative to typical sandwiches, especially when entertaining guests. Old commercials and TV segments from the golden age of broadcasting sometimes showcase the dish as a fancy but frugal approach. In autumn, butternut or acorn squash rings took center stage, while in summer, zucchini or yellow squash substituted nicely. Baby boomers remember seeing these ringed creations at grandparents' homes, often served with a side of bread and butter pickles. Over time, the dish faced stiff competition from quicker, more standardized lunches that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. Think sliced deli meats, mass-produced snack foods, and the unstoppable rise of fast food chains. Consumers grew less inclined to devote time to hollowing and filling squash slices during the midday rush. As preferences shifted toward convenience, squash ring delight lost traction. Tracing 100 online mentions from archived cooking shows and local newspaper columns indicates that by the late 20th century, the dish had almost completely fallen off the culinary map. Modern diets may celebrate roasted squash, but rarely in ring form stuffed with creamed fillings. The labor-intensive nature and old-fashioned aesthetic effectively relegated it to the vault of forgotten lunches. Number 10. Fruited turkey mold. This final entry emerged in the 1970s as an attempt to reinvent leftover holiday turkey beyond the standard sandwich. Fruited turkey mold combined chopped leftover turkey with gelatin, fruit cocktail, often including peaches, pears, and grapes in syrup, and sometimes chopped walnuts for crunch. The entire mixture was chilled in a bundt pan or ring mold, then sliced for lunchtime servings. Glowing magazine adverts suggested topping each slice with a dollop of cranberry sauce or sweet dressing, extolling the virtues of presenting leftover poultry in a festive mold. By weaving turkey into a gelatin base with sweet canned fruit, home cooks aim to breathe new life into otherwise dull leftovers. This somewhat resembled the broader 1970s mania for congealed salads, an era that produced countless recipes calling for whimsical flavor juxtapositions. Baby boomers who grew up around family gatherings might recall the initial surprise, or horror, at the concept of turkey morsels suspended among sugary fruit bits. While it was indeed creative, many found the taste jarring, and the assembly process involved multiple steps: chopping meat, draining fruit, preparing gelatin. As convenience foods and direct turkey sandwiches rose in popularity throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, the impetus to transform leftovers into elaborate molds dwindled. The ephemeral fruited turkey mold swiftly receded from mainstream cookbooks, overshadowed by simpler leftover recipes that required fewer ingredients and less fuss. Sorting through 100 vintage culinary references reveals sporadic mentions, primarily from the southeastern United States. Today, it is seldom discussed outside of retro recipe groups or holiday novelty segments. Modern cooks typically repurpose turkey via hearty soups, pot pies, or straightforward cold sandwiches, leaving behind the era of whimsical lunch molds. The fruited turkey mold remains a testament to a time when aspirational cooking hinged on gelatin-based displays, ephemeral color combinations, and the widespread availability of canned fruit, all orchestrated to dazzle at midday.